So thank you so much for the introduction. I know that today's talks are pretty STEM themed, but I'm going to use my time to take a small step away from that to shed some light on a problem that affects everyone and how you can get involved with STEM. This all started when my STEM plans this summer got canceled because of COVID-19, so I ended up taking some classes at Georgia State University online. In my political science class, around the beginning of June, we were presented with a civic engagement project where we were tasked with becoming politically active on a topic of our choice amid the coronavirus pandemic. On June 9th, while I was helplessly thinking to myself that there's no possible way that I could come up with a topic to become passionate about and be able to become civically engaged amid COVID 19, and that I should probably choose the alternate option, which was a 10-page literature review paper. But then I turned on the local news. June 9th was Georgia's primary, which was moved from its original date due to COVID 19, but despite the new date, things went terribly. Let me read you an account from a first time Georgia voter, Daryl Marvin, published in the New York Times. Mr. Marvin had previously lived in Connecticut, where voting was a brisk process measured in minutes. But on the day of the primary, June 9th, he and his wife waited for 4 hours to vote at Park Tavern, an Atlanta restaurant where more than 16,000 voters were consolidated into a single precinct. An electrical engineer by training, Mr. Marvin was baffled by what he saw when he finally got inside, which was a station with 15 to 20 touchscreens on which to vote, but only a single scanner to process the printed ballots. The scanner was the choke point, he said. Nobody thought about it, and this is Operations Research 101. It's not very difficult to figure it out. And this story was one of the lucky ones. Across primarily minority precincts, voters waited in long lines captured on the news, with some precincts staying open as late as 9 o'clock, just to exercise their right to participate in government, while simultaneously putting themselves at risk during the pandemic. As you can see, people in these photos not everybody's wearing masks, and that's because voting districts in my state can't enforce a mask policy because Governor Brian Kemp literally sued Fulton County for going against his executive order by attempting to implement a mandatory mask rule in county facilities. That's when I got my idea for my civic engagement project, which was voter suppression. Historically, voter suppression in the United States manifested itself in the form of impossible literacy tests, outrageous poll taxes, and grandfather clauses. These were so problematic that multiple constitutional amendments were ratified, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed just to try to give everyone their right to vote as guaranteed by the Constitution. Despite that legislation, there are many voter suppression tactics that fly under the radar in today's world, and they deprive millions of people their chance to participate in government. These tactics are especially difficult to pass legislation for, because each state decides how to run elections and each district is independently responsible for implementing the state's strategy. So let's start with one of the most detrimental forms of voter suppression, which is voter purges. Let me set the scene. Imagine showing up to vote for the first time in less than a decade, but when they check the voter records, they say, "Sorry, you're no longer registered to vote anymore." In my beautiful peach state of Georgia, use it or lose it laws removed 500,000 voters from Georgia's voter rolls in July 2017, 107,000 of which were removed for simply not voting in the past. This process was overseen by then Secretary of State Brian Kemp, who narrowly beat Yale graduate Stacey Abrams by 55,000 votes for governor the following year. Cleaning up records is a necessary process because, well, people die and they also move out of a given jurisdiction. But states use this process to disenfranchise large groups of voters. Sadly, this isn't specific to Georgia. A recent study by the Brennan Center found that almost 16 million voters were purged between 2014 and 2016 across America, with jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination having significantly higher purge rates. Well, let's say you didn't get wiped. It's time to talk about voter ID laws. 36 states have them, with 7 states with strict no exception photo ID laws. 11% of legal US citizens, which is more than 21 million Americans, don't actually have photo identification. And that's completely okay because there's nothing that requires it except for this in some states. And that's because obtaining an ID costs lots of money, even for a citizen. There are many underlying documents, travel expenses, as well as a significant amount of time that comes to an estimated cost that ranges from $75 to $175, according to a 2014 Harvard estimate. These laws are discriminatory because minority voters disproportionately lack ID. Nationally, up to 25% of African American citizens of voting age lack government-issued photo ID, compared to only 8% of white citizens. Rural citizens are also disproportionately hindered. Some residences in Texas are approximately 170 miles from the nearest ID office. Elderly people and those who are disabled also often struggle to meet the requirement. In fact, a 2014 study by the US Government Accountability Office found that this reduces voter turnout by 2 to 3 percentage points, which means tens of thousands of votes are lost in a single state each and every election. The map on screen shows states that have voter ID laws to varying degrees of intensity. And finally, the last method I want to talk about in depth, and possibly the most important after the 2020 census, is partisan gerrymandering. Thanks to recent media movements and new standards in public schools, gerrymandering needs little introduction. But for those who are unfamiliar with it, state legislators manipulate the process of redrawing voting district lines by packing certain groups of voters together to limit their voice across multiple districts, instead throwing away one. This year, with the 2020 census, means that the new district lines will determine our political voice for the next decade. This means that it's super important that the census is kept fair and representative of our nation's people. But historically, the census has had many problems with discrimination. And this year, officials wanted to add questions like, "Are you a citizen?" to the census, which would discourage those without documentation from replying, giving their districts a lower population, which means less funding is allocated to the area, and it is underrepresented in government. While there are many other methods of voter suppression that fly under the radar, like felony disenfranchisement, which disproportionately affects minority voters due to racial bias in the criminal justice system, and exact match laws, it's important that we look at ways to combat these to STEM students. And as we look forward to our careers, to give everyone a chance to participate in our democratic process. STEM plays a huge role in our democratic process and how we can make it better. Firstly, they help define the problem at hand. None of the problems I just outlined could be quantized without STEM personnel. Secondly, they help create unique solutions for solving this nation's voting problem. Since elections are run differently from state to state, these aren't one size fits all, and I also can't post resources for individual states for that reason, nor will they immediately end voter suppression. But bit by bit, they will make a difference for you and your community. So let's start with the easy stuff. Firstly, register to vote. You can do this as early as 17 and a half years old, and it takes about 2 minutes online. If it's been more than 4 years since you last voted, it's worth taking the 20 seconds to check to see if you're still registered to vote using your state's resources. This year, apply for an absentee ballot, also known as mail-in voting, to avoid long lines at the polling place and avoid exposing yourself. The application takes minutes, and depending on your state, you may have already received one in the mail. You can also vote early in person at certain designated polling places without an excuse in most states. The map on screen will show you if you need an excuse, and the excuse can be as easy as saying that you weren't in the county for the election, and if you were sick or otherwise physically unable to attend. In light of recent events, though, it may be in your best interest to locate a place that can accept your mail-in ballot in person. Many city halls have video monitored ballot boxes that you can use to make sure your vote counts. Next, actually become an informed voter. This means that you know what's going to be on the ballot before you show up to make the process smoother, and then actually show up to vote and keep doing it. That's kind of the bare minimum, but let me tell you a couple ways that you can go above and beyond. Firstly, to protect minority voters, the Voting Rights Advancement Act needs to be passed after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013. It essentially modernizes the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and combats discriminatory voter requirements that prevent minorities, the elderly, disabled, and youth from voting. This QR code will bring you straight to the ACLU's tool to email your senators with an adjustable pre-written message. Secondly, on a more local level, you can relieve some of the stress on your local polling place by becoming a poll worker if you feel comfortable doing so amid the pandemic. Poll worker shortages are expected because seniors that normally participate cannot due to COVID-19 concerns, leading to long lines and delays. And you can help. The application takes less than 2 minutes to fill out, and you get paid pretty well considering that you can start at 16 and there's no pre-requirements and little training, but it varies from county to county. In my county, you get paid $125 per day as a basic poll worker, $175 as an assistant manager, and $225 as a manager. And finally, spread the word and help others around you become informed. This presidential election is set to be the biggest in our nation's history. Make sure you and your community are properly represented to bring America together towards a brighter future. And that's all. I'd like to thank you all for your time and this opportunity, as well as the Mayor of Dunwoody, Lynn Deutsch, who provided some wonderful insight, and my professor at Georgia State, Professor Murphy.